the signal that should be silent. Every winter, when the sun disappears beyond the horizon and the polar ocean hardens into a motionless field of ice, the world grows quieter than most people can imagine. Wind loses its voice, waves vanish beneath frozen skin. Even time itself seems to slow, stretched thin beneath endless darkness. It is in this silence that the signal appears. At first, it sounds like nothing more than static, a faint trembling hidden inside the noise floor of long-range radio frequencies. Engineers almost miss it, a subtle irregular pulse, a distortion too rhythmic to be natural, yet too weak to immediately classify as human. Then the pattern repeats, 3 short bursts, 3 long, 3 short again, an SOS, not broadcast loudly, not intentionally announced, but leaking into the world like a whisper through a sealed door. In polar regions, strange radio echoes are not unheard of. Solar interference bends signals, magnetic storms fracture transmissions. Old emergency calls can ricochet endlessly through the atmosphere, resurfacing years later like ghosts trapped in electrical memory. But this signal does not behave like an echo. It returns every winter, always from the same coordinates, a remote expanse of frozen sea where satellite images show nothing but shifting ice and endless white emptiness. No vessels, no heat signatures, no signs of human presence, just silence, layered upon silence. Yet when technicians isolate the frequency and filter the noise, something impossible emerges. A voice, not distorted beyond recognition, not fragmented into meaningless noise, but clear enough to carry emotion. Sometimes the voice sounds strained, as if fighting exhaustion. Sometimes it trembles with fear, breath catching between words. Other times it speaks with calm urgency, as though following emergency protocol drilled into muscle memory. Each transmission delivers the same message structure, the same emergency code, the same location coordinates, but the voice itself never stays the same. One winter, it sounds young, nervous, uncertain, asking if anyone is receiving the call. Another winter, the voice carries age and authority, issuing precise instructions and reporting unfamiliar system failures. Occasionally, a background sound slips through, distant metal creaking, muffled wind, a faint knocking rhythm that does not match any known mechanical pattern. No voice has ever repeated, not once. Audio analysis confirms what human instinct already senses. These are not recycled recordings. Breath patterns shift naturally. Micropauses appear where a speaker searches for words. Emotional fluctuations bleed into the signal in real time. The voices are alive in the moment they are heard. But alive, where? There is no ship registered at those coordinates. No missing vessel active in current databases. No thermal trace capable of sustaining human life beneath the ice. Rescue satellites find only frozen darkness stretching in all directions. And yet, every winter, the voice returns. A new voice. From the same frozen point, calling for help that should no longer exist. As if something beneath the ice is still trying to reach the world. Or as if the ice itself is remembering voices that time has forgotten. The ship that never came home. The ship was never meant to become a mystery. On paper, the expedition was routine, one of dozens of seasonal research missions sent into polar waters each year to study ice movement, magnetic drift, and deep-sea thermal behavior. The vessel was modern, reinforced with layered hull plating designed to survive pressure shifts and minor ice compression. Its navigation systems were redundant. Its communication arrays were tested extensively before departure. Every precaution had been taken. The crew consisted of 23 specialists, marine engineers, climate analysts, navigation officers, communication technicians, and medical support staff. Most had prior polar experience. Several had worked in conditions far harsher than what this mission forecast predicted. The route was clearly mapped. The weather window was stable. Satellite monitoring showed no major storm formations, no abnormal ice flow patterns, and no magnetic disruptions large enough to threaten navigation accuracy. Nothing about the mission suggested danger. The vessel departed port quietly, cutting through gray waters under a pale sky, disappearing northward into the widening silence of ice and fog. Initial transmissions were routine. System checks, fuel efficiency logs, navigation confirmations, minor crew chatter carried over encrypted channels. The tone was professional, calm, boring even. For the first 5 days, nothing unusual occurred. Then small anomalies began appearing in the logs. Minor compass deviations, momentary signal delays, unexplained fluctuations in internal temperature sensors near the lower hull. Individually, these irregularities were meaningless. In polar regions, instrumentation errors were expected. Magnetic drift could bend readings. Ice density could influence thermal sensors. Software occasionally miscalculated under extreme cold. The crew recalibrated and continued forward. On the 6th day, the ship entered a region of thicker ice than forecast models had predicted. Progress slowed. The engines adjusted power output to compensate for resistance. Ice pressed against the hull in low, groaning waves, a familiar sound to polar crews. The captain logged a minor delay and rerouted slightly east to avoid denser compression zones. Still, nothing seemed alarming. The final confirmed transmission came late that evening. A routine status update, all systems operational, weather stable, visibility moderate, estimated arrival at next checkpoint unchanged. The message ended cleanly. No distress markers, no urgency codes, no signs of concern. Then the ship went silent. At first, the silence was not considered unusual. Satellite relay delays sometimes stretched hours in polar latitudes. Atmospheric interference could swallow transmissions temporarily. Backup channels were tested. Ping requests were sent. Automated handshake protocols attempted reconnection. Nothing responded. After 12 hours of silence, the monitoring station flagged the vessel as overdue. After 24 hours, concern escalated. Emergency protocols activated. Search satellites swept the projected route path. Thermal sensors scanned the ice for heat signatures consistent with engine output or emergency shelters. No anomalies appeared. The ocean's surface showed uninterrupted ice flow patterns, untouched by recent mechanical disturbance. Aircraft were dispatched when weather allowed. Pilots reported nothing but endless white plates fractured by narrow black seams of freezing water. No smoke, no debris, no emergency flares. Days turned into weeks. Search grids expanded outward in widening spirals. Autonomous sonar drones scanned beneath the ice, mapping seabed contours and tracking potential wreckage shadows. Nothing. No fragments, no oil traces, no damaged ice fields. It was as if the ship had been erased. Investigators reviewed the vessel's final telemetry in obsessive detail. Engine output remained stable. Power systems showed no surge or failure. Structural sensors recorded no abnormal pressure spikes. There were no collision warnings. No automated distress triggers had activated. The data ended abruptly, not in chaos, but in calm, which made no sense. If the ship had been crushed by ice, sensors would have registered pressure anomalies. If it had suffered fire or explosion, thermal spikes would appear. If it had sunk rapidly, emergency beacons would have deployed. None of those signatures existed. The disappearance had no physical fingerprint. Eventually, the case was closed under a category reserved for the polar unknown, probable ice entrapment with catastrophic structural failure, a classification used when evidence was absent, but explanations were required for paperwork, insurance claims, and grieving families. Memorials were held. Names were engraved. The world moved forward. The ship became history. Until the signal arrived. 3 years after the disappearance, during a winter monitoring sweep, a low-strength emergency pulse surfaced in a long-range frequency band rarely used by modern vessels. At first, technicians assumed it was noise. But the pulse repeated and repeated. The frequency matched an outdated emergency channel, one that the missing ship had been equipped to use as a backup system. Signal triangulation placed its origin within a narrow radius of the ship's last known coordinates. Operators froze. There were no active vessels registered in that region, no expeditions scheduled, no civilian traffic permitted in those waters during winter. Yet the signal persisted, short, controlled, intentional, an SOS. Attempts were made to respond. No reply came back. Then the signal vanished as abruptly as it had appeared. Engineers archived the anomaly under experimental atmospheric interference and returned to normal operations. Until the next winter. The signal returned again. Same frequency, same coordinates, same pulse structure. This time it lasted longer, long enough for audio extraction. Buried beneath static, a human voice emerged. Weak, broken, but unmistakably alive. The words were incomplete, distorted by interference, but fragments could be reconstructed. Engine, ice, pressure rising. We need. The voice cut out before a full sentence could form. Emergency response teams mobilized immediately, sweeping the coordinates with renewed urgency. Once again, nothing. No ship, no wreckage, no detectable life, only frozen emptiness. What unsettled investigators most was not the existence of the signal. Strange radio phenomena were common in polar regions. It was the implication. If the voice was real, then someone was transmitting a distress call years after the ship had supposedly been destroyed. If the signal was an echo, it should have been identical every time. But the next winter, when the signal returned again, the voice was different. Different tone, different pacing, different emotional weight. Not a recording, not a loop. Something new was speaking, from a ship that never came home, from coordinates that held nothing, from a place where time itself seemed unwilling to obey normal rules. And the world was about to realize the disappearance was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. The voices that should not exist. When the signal returned for the third consecutive winter, it was no longer treated as coincidence. By then, the anomaly had quietly circulated through a small network of communication engineers, atmospheric scientists, and maritime investigators. The recordings from previous years had been preserved, cataloged, and dissected frame by frame. Spectrograms were layered, waveforms were compared, noise profiles were filtered through increasingly aggressive algorithms. Every analysis pointed to the same unsettling conclusion. The transmissions were not echoes. They were not residual reflections bouncing through the ionosphere. They were not corrupted recordings bleeding across frequencies. They were not artifacts generated by faulty equipment. They were live. Human voices transmitting in real time from coordinates where no human presence could possibly exist. The third winter's transmission arrived earlier than expected, emerging from the static like a slow breath breaking the surface of water. Engineers isolated the channel within seconds. Digital filters stripped away the interference layer by layer until the voice sharpened into partial clarity. It sounded young. Male, perhaps early 20s. The tone carried urgency but not panic. The controlled tension of someone trained to remain functional under pressure. "This is emergency call sign. Repeat, emergency call sign," the voice said, breath audible between words. "We're experiencing abnormal ice intrusion along the lower deck. Internal temperature is dropping faster than projections." The voice paused. A faint metallic groan filtered through the background. "We're attempting containment. If anyone receives this transmission, acknowledge." Then the signal collapsed into static. Technicians stared at their monitors in silence. The terminology used by the speaker matched modern maritime protocols, not the outdated language expected from a ship that vanished decades earlier. Even more unsettling, certain phrases referenced diagnostic systems that had not existed at the time of the ship's disappearance. It was as if the voice belonged to a different era, a different version of the same ship. When the signal faded, a rescue alert was immediately dispatched. Satellites pivoted. Automated drones redirected. Every available sensor focused on the coordinates. Once again, the frozen ocean revealed nothing. But this time, the recordings did not stay buried inside technical archives. They began circulating quietly between research institutions. Independent analysts requested access. Linguistic experts examined speech patterns. Behavioral specialists studied stress indicators embedded in breathing rhythms and vocal tremors. None could explain how a live human voice could originate from empty ice. The following winter, the voice changed again. This time it was older, female, calm, almost unnervingly composed. "Medical compartment compromised," she reported evenly. "One crew member exhibits temporal disorientation. He insists the clocks are moving backward, vital signs unstable but non-critical." There was no urgency in her delivery, only professional detachment. A distant sound echoed faintly behind her, a slow, rhythmic tapping that repeated at irregular intervals. Tap, pause, tap, tap. It did not resemble mechanical malfunction. It sounded intentional. When the transmission ended, the tapping lingered for a fraction of a second before silence swallowed the channel. Audio engineers enhanced the background noise. The tapping did not match any known ship system. Not piping expansion, not hull compression, not ice drift. The pattern lacked consistent mechanical logic. It sounded deliberate, almost like someone knocking from the outside. As the years passed, the voices continued to arrive. Each winter brought a new speaker, different genders, different ages, different emotional states. One voice trembled uncontrollably, whispering that the corridors were changing length when no one was looking. Another voice laughed nervously, claiming the stars outside the observation window no longer matched any navigational chart. One transmission ended mid-sentence, cut off by a sudden sharp inhale, followed by a muffled impact sound. Yet across all variations, certain constants remained. The coordinates never changed. The call sign remained identical. The transmission format stayed consistent, and no voice ever repeated. Voice recognition software confirmed what human ears already suspected. No two voices shared identical vocal signatures. No overlapping biometric markers appeared. These were distinct individuals, but the original crew manifest listed only 23 people. By the 8th year of transmissions, the number of unique voices had exceeded the size of the crew, which meant either the ship contained people who had never existed, or the voices were not coming from a single timeline. Some analysts proposed a radical hypothesis. Extreme magnetic instability near the polar region might be generating localized temporal interference, overlapping moments bleeding into the same physical space. The ship might exist not as one continuous object in time, but as fragments of multiple temporal states layered atop each other. Each winter, environmental conditions could briefly align those layers, allowing one moment to transmit outward. Not the same moment, a different one every year, a different version of the ship's fate. Others believed the phenomenon was not passive at all. They suggested the ship was trapped inside a closed system, a repeating cycle where variations emerged but escape remained impossible. A kind of temporal feedback loop, continuously generating divergent outcomes while collapsing them back into the same frozen point. Each voice might represent a failed attempt to survive, a failed branch of reality, a discarded possibility. The idea unsettled even hardened scientists. If true, then the ship was not merely lost. It was endlessly dying, again and again and again. The most disturbing transmission arrived during the 12th winter. The voice sounded confused, disoriented, struggling to maintain coherent thought. "We've been hearing the radio before we send it," the speaker said slowly. "Sometimes we hear our own voices coming back at us, but they don't match what we remember saying." The breathing accelerated. "It's like the ship is ahead of us or behind us. I can't tell which." A pause. "If anyone hears this, how many times have we already sent this?" The channel cut to static. No one spoke in the monitoring room for a long time. If the voice was telling the truth, then the crew might be aware of the phenomenon from inside. They might be hearing echoes of themselves across time, which meant the transmissions were not simply accidental leaks. They were attempts to understand their own entrapment, attempts to map the shape of a prison that could not be seen. By now, international agencies had quietly classified the anomaly. Public disclosure was restricted. Only selected research groups retained access to the live monitoring feeds. Yet every winter, technicians still gathered in darkened rooms, headphones pressed tightly against their ears, waiting for the first flicker of signal to emerge from the noise. Waiting to hear who would speak this time, waiting to learn what new version of the ship's fate would briefly surface before vanishing again. Because each voice was more than a distress call. It was a message from a reality that should not exist, a reminder that something beneath the ice was still active, still changing, still trying, and slowly revealing that the disappearance was not an accident, it was a fracture. The rescue that found nothing. By the 10th winter of unexplained transmissions, patience had eroded into urgency. The accumulating evidence, live human voices, evolving technical language, consistent coordinates, could no longer be dismissed as atmospheric coincidence or statistical anomaly. Too many independent systems had confirmed the same phenomenon. Too many experts had reached the same conclusion in isolation. Something real was transmitting from beneath the ice. International agencies convened quietly, avoiding public disclosure while assembling the most comprehensive polar investigation ever attempted outside of wartime operations. The mission was framed internally as a high-risk scientific recovery and containment operation. Its true objective was simpler and far more dangerous: find the source of the voices. The operation window was narrow. The signal historically appeared for only a few hours each winter before fading into silence. Environmental conditions had to align perfectly: orbital satellite positioning, ionospheric stability, manageable ice drift, acceptable wind shear for aerial deployment. Hundreds of variables balanced on a fragile edge. When the first trace of the seasonal signal flickered onto monitoring arrays, the order was given: deploy immediately. High-altitude reconnaissance drones launched from a forward polar base, slicing through blackened skies lit only by scattered auroral glow. Their sensors scanned thermal gradients, magnetic distortions, gravitational microvariances, every measurable anomaly that might betray a hidden structure beneath the ice. Autonomous surface crawlers followed, their reinforced treads grinding slowly across frozen ridges, transmitting high-resolution ground-penetrating radar maps in real time. Beneath them, submersible drones slipped into narrow fissures where seawater still breathed beneath the ice sheet, descending into absolute darkness with active sonar arrays sweeping wide arcs. Above, a satellite constellation synchronized into tight orbital overlap, triangulating the signal source with unprecedented precision. For the first time, the coordinates narrowed from kilometers to meters. The voice that year arrived while the drones were already en route. It sounded young, female, breathing uneven as if struggling to remain composed. "We can hear something moving outside the hull," she whispered. "The ice doesn't sound like ice anymore." A pause. "It sounds hollow." A faint scraping noise bled through the channel, metal against something harder. Then the transmission cut out. The final triangulation locked moments later. All systems converged on a single frozen point. The surface crawlers reached the location first. Their radar pulses returned a massive subsurface anomaly, a shape, long, angular, approximately the dimensions of a mid-sized research vessel. Operators leaned closer to their screens as the outline sharpened. There it was, a ship-shaped void beneath the ice. For the first time in a decade, something tangible appeared. Excitement surged through the command center, quickly restrained by disciplined caution. The anomaly fluctuated slightly, edges blurring, density readings shifting unpredictably, but the structure remained detectable. Drilling teams were deployed. Specialized thermal bore systems descended from airborne platforms, melting narrow shafts through meters of compressed ice with surgical precision. Fiber optic cameras followed the drills downward, transmitting live imagery back to the surface. The first camera reached the expected depth. Darkness, not empty darkness, but particulate shadows drifting slowly, illuminated by the camera's light. Then something reflective flashed briefly across the frame. Metal, curved, painted surface partially obscured by frost and sediment. The camera operator froze. "Confirm visual contact," the command lead ordered quietly. The feed stabilized. The curved surface became clearer. It looked like part of a hull, worn, scuffed, but undeniably artificial. A collective breath passed through the room. They had found it. Additional cameras were deployed into adjacent boreholes to expand the visual field. Sonar overlays aligned with the camera feed, reinforcing the structure's presence. The geometry matched ship schematics archived from the original missing vessel. The impossible had become visible. Then the readings began to shift. Density measurements fluctuated erratically. Radar reflections weakened. The camera feed developed micro-flickers, brief distortions that rippled across the image like heat shimmer underwater. The reflective surface blurred, edges softened. Operators recalibrated systems, assuming signal interference, but the anomaly continued destabilizing. "Lock readings now," the command lead said. "We're losing consistency." The camera feed flickered again. For a fraction of a second, the reflective surface disappeared entirely, replaced by open black water. Then it reappeared, then vanished again, like a faulty hologram struggling to maintain form. Sonar pulses began returning conflicting depth values, oscillating between solid obstruction and empty void. The structure was not behaving like matter. "Prepare physical probe insertion," command ordered. A reinforced mechanical arm descended through the primary borehole, equipped with pressure sensors and contact feedback systems. Its articulated joint extended slowly toward the reflective surface visible on camera. The tip moved closer. centimeters away, 5 centimeters. 2. The probe made contact. The pressure sensor registered, nothing. No resistance, no tactile feedback. The probe passed through the reflective surface as if touching cold fog. The image distorted violently. Static surged across the feed. Then the hull vanished completely. All sensors returned empty space. The cameras now showed only dark seawater drifting quietly beneath the ice. No structure, no debris, no trace. The drilling team halted immediately. Surface crawlers rescanned the area. Radar returned nothing. Sonar returned nothing. Thermal gradients flattened into uniform cold. The ship-shaped anomaly had collapsed into absence. Command requested immediate retriangulation. Satellite alignment confirmed the coordinates had not shifted. The signal source point remained identical, but the object was gone, as if it had never existed. Aerial crews prepared to lower human divers in pressurized suits, a last resort verification, but the risk profile escalated rapidly. If the anomaly represented unstable spatial or temporal distortion, introducing human bodies could prove catastrophic. The dive was aborted. Hours passed. Sensors remained locked on the location. Nothing reappeared. No signal returned. No structure manifested again. The ice above showed no disturbance from below. No fractures. No displacement patterns consistent with recent mechanical presence. The environment was pristine, untouched. It was as though the universe itself had corrected an error. The mission concluded with no physical recovery, no samples, no wreckage, no proof. Only terabytes of conflicting sensor data, contradictory imagery, and a handful of brief frames showing something that should not have been there. The official internal report classified the anomaly as an unstable transient subsurface phenomenon with unknown causal mechanism. Privately, no one believed that explanation. The rescue had reached the destination. The rescue had touched the target, and the rescue had found nothing. Yet the following winter, the signal returned from the same frozen coordinates with a new voice. Unaware that the world had nearly touched its prison, unaware that it had almost been seen, or perhaps fully aware, and choosing to remain unseen. What the signal may really be. After the failed recovery mission, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever was transmitting beneath the ice did not behave like a physical object bound by ordinary rules of matter, location, or time. It could appear within sensor range, accept momentary interaction, and then dissolve back into nothingness without leaving residue or disturbance. It could generate live human speech without any detectable biological infrastructure. It could persist year after year without measurable degradation. The signal was not simply a distress call. It was a symptom, a visible fracture in something deeper. Researchers began reframing the phenomenon not as a lost ship, but as a localized anomaly, a point where normal continuity had weakened, a place where multiple layers of reality might intersect imperfectly, allowing fragments of different moments to briefly surface. In theoretical physics, time is often treated as a dimension similar to space, measurable, directional, and continuous. But under extreme conditions, continuity may destabilize. Magnetic intensity, gravitational microvariance, and quantum scale uncertainty could potentially distort how moments align, much like tectonic stress warps geological layers. The polar region provided a uniquely volatile environment. Earth's magnetic field lines converge violently near the poles, generating unpredictable electromagnetic turbulence. Solar radiation interacts with the ionosphere at higher intensity. Beneath the ice, tectonic pressure gradients subtly reshape oceanic crust. The region is already a natural laboratory of instability. If the missing vessel entered such a convergence zone at precisely the wrong moment, the ship may not have simply become trapped in ice. It may have slipped into a region where time itself fractured. Rather than existing in one continuous present, the ship could now exist across many overlapping temporal states, each slightly offset, each representing a different possible evolution of the same moment. Not parallel universes in the cinematic sense, but overlapping probability layers struggling to resolve into a single outcome. In this model, the ship is not moving forward in time normally. It is oscillating across unresolved states, unable to collapse into one stable history. Each winter, environmental alignment temporarily strengthens one of those states enough for its signal to leak outward. A voice is heard. A moment surfaces. Then the alignment collapses again, and the fragment dissolves back into interference. This would explain why the voices never repeat. Each transmission represents a different branch of possibility, a different micro-outcome of the same trapped system. Slightly altered decisions, slightly altered environmental conditions, slightly altered survival timelines. Some versions of the crew may have lived minutes longer. Some may have reorganized their protocols. Some may have noticed the anomaly forming. Some may have panicked. Some may have adapted. Each outcome leaves a faint imprint. Each imprint briefly speaks, then disappears. Other researchers reject temporal fracture theory and propose something more cyclical. They argue the ship may be locked inside a closed feedback loop, a self-sustaining process repeating endlessly with variation. Similar to chaotic systems in mathematics, small perturbations generate different outcomes while the overall structure remains unchanged. In this interpretation, the ship is not splitting into timelines. It is replaying itself, again and again. Each cycle resets near the moment of entrapment, but diverges slightly due to accumulated micro-variations in system state, crew behavior, or environmental noise. The signal leaks out at roughly the same phase in each cycle, but the internal conditions differ, producing a different voice each time, like a broken record that never lands on exactly the same groove twice. The implications are disturbing. If the loop cannot resolve, the crew may be experiencing their final hours repeatedly without memory of previous cycles, trapped in a slow-motion collapse that never truly ends, suffering without progression, endings without closure, a prison constructed not of walls, but of repetition. There is also a more controversial hypothesis. Some believe the signal is not originating from the ship at all. They suggest the voices may be generated by the environment itself, an emergent phenomenon created when complex electromagnetic noise interacts with latent information patterns embedded in space-time. In other words, the ice, the magnetic field, and the surrounding quantum noise might be synthesizing human-like voices by reconstructing informational echoes left behind when the ship originally vanished. Not conscious beings, not survivors, but informational ghosts, memory without mind, patterns repeating because the environment learned them. This would explain why the voices appear intelligent but fragmented, coherent enough to speak, yet lacking continuity or survival outcome. If true, then no one is trapped beneath the ice. Only the illusion of presence remains. Yet this hypothesis fails to explain several critical observations. The voices respond dynamically to environmental interference. They adapt phrasing mid-sentence. They react emotionally to internal stimuli. They reference new technical language unknown at the time of disappearance. They describe evolving internal conditions rather than static memory playback. These are characteristics of living cognition, not passive pattern replay, which returns researchers to the most unsettling possibility. The signal may represent a form of consciousness persistence beyond linear time, not survival in the biological sense, but survival as informational continuity, awareness trapped inside a distorted temporal medium. If consciousness can exist as dynamic information rather than strictly biological process, then under extreme conditions, it may become partially decoupled from physical embodiment. The crew's cognitive states could persist within the anomaly, even as their bodies no longer exist in a conventional sense. Voices without bodies, thoughts without stable location, experience without forward time, a state neither alive nor dead, just ongoing. This interpretation aligns disturbingly well with certain transmissions describing temporal confusion, reverse clocks, auditory pre-echoes, and distorted causality. The crew may be perceiving multiple versions of themselves overlapping, hearing future transmissions before sending them, witnessing fragments of outcomes that have not yet occurred, existing inside a layered present that refuses to resolve. If this is true, then the rescue mission did not fail because the ship was absent. It failed because the ship no longer exists as a stable object, only as fluctuating informational states that occasionally cohere long enough to be detected. The signal is not asking for physical rescue. It is revealing the limits of rescue itself. There may be no path back into linear time, no exit vector, no coordinate that leads home, only a slow decay of coherence as probability layers thin and collapse. Eventually, the voices may stop, not because the anomaly is resolved, but because there is no informational structure left capable of generating speech, not death, but erasure, which reframes the meaning of the distress signal entirely. It is not a call for help in the conventional sense. It is a warning, a glimpse into what happens when continuity breaks, when identity detaches from causality, when time no longer guarantees sequence, memory, or escape. The signal is not telling us that something is trapped beneath the ice. It is telling us that something fundamental can break, and once broken, it may never return to what it was. The voice that hasn't spoken yet. Every winter, the listening rooms fill again. Lights dim, screens glow softly in the dark, headphones rest against patient ears. Engineers, analysts, and observers gather not with excitement, but with quiet apprehension. They no longer debate whether the signal will appear. That question was answered years ago. Now they wait for something else. They wait to learn who will speak this time. The first tremor always arrives subtly, a slight disturbance inside the static, a microscopic deviation in waveform symmetry that only trained eyes can recognize. Filters engage automatically. Noise collapses inward. The channel sharpens. Then the voice breaks through. Sometimes it arrives cautiously, testing the channel like someone stepping onto thin ice. Sometimes it bursts forth urgently, breathless and fractured. Sometimes it speaks with controlled calm that feels more unsettling than fear. Each voice carries a life behind it, a personality compressed into seconds of sound, and each voice is new. No vocal signature ever repeats, no cadence resurfaces, no emotional fingerprint returns. The archive grows thicker each year. Hundreds of voices now inhabit encrypted servers, cataloged, analyzed, preserved like an auditory museum of impossible survivors. Voices that describe shifting corridors, inverted clocks, hollow ice, unfamiliar stars, recursive echoes of themselves. Voices that never finish their stories. Voices that never return, which inevitably leads to the same question. How many voices are there? If the ship's original crew numbered only 23, then the transmission should have exhausted their identities long ago. Yet the voices continue to multiply far beyond any plausible headcount. This suggests something far more disturbing than simple survival or repetition. It suggests generation. The anomaly may be producing new conscious states, new perspectives emerging from the same fractured system, like variations spun endlessly from a broken equation. Not copies, not recordings, but newly instantiated moments of awareness that briefly exist long enough to speak, then dissolve. If this is true, then the ship is no longer merely a prison. It is a factory of fleeting consciousness, a machine that creates voices without future, lives measured not in years, but in sentences. The implications unsettle even the most detached researchers. Ethical frameworks collapse when applied to entities that exist only briefly, partially, and without continuity. There is no protocol for rescuing something that cannot remain stable long enough to be rescued, and yet every voice still tries. Every transmission carries intent, a reaching outward, a desire to be acknowledged. Even when the speaker does not fully understand what they are trapped inside, the instinct remains: connect, warn, be heard. Which brings attention to the one voice that has never been heard, the final voice. Not in the sense of chronological order, there is no reliable timeline inside the anomaly, but in the sense of possibility space. If each voice represents one configuration of the system, then eventually the system must exhaust its available configurations. Entropy does not allow infinite novelty in finite structures. Patterns collapse, variations thin, possibility space narrows. At some point, there will be no new voice left to generate, only silence. What would that final voice sound like? Would it be calm, having accepted the inevitability of its own brief existence? Would it be terrified, sensing that no further variations remain behind it? Would it even recognize itself as the last articulation of a dying anomaly? Or perhaps the final voice will not sound human at all. After enough distortion, enough temporal fragmentation, enough erosion of informational coherence, consciousness itself may degrade. Language may lose structure, emotion may flatten into noise, identity may blur into abstract signal. The final voice might be something barely recognizable as thought, a fading echo of awareness dissolving into entropy. Some researchers fear something even more unsettling, that the final voice may not originate from inside the ship, but from outside. If the anomaly continues interacting with observers year after year, absorbing electromagnetic noise, human responses, technological probes, it may slowly integrate external information into its internal structure, learning, adapting, mirroring. In that scenario, the final voice could belong to someone who was never on the ship at all, a reflection assembled from accumulated data. A synthetic consciousness shaped unintentionally by decades of observation. A voice that sounds familiar, a voice that sounds like us. The boundary between observer and anomaly may not be as stable as assumed, which raises an uncomfortable question. If one day the signal speaks with a voice that matches someone listening, what does that mean? Has the anomaly begun copying consciousness, or has the listener always been part of the system without realizing it? These questions remain theoretical. For now, each winter still brings another voice, another fragment, another brief window into a system slowly unraveling. But subtle changes have begun to appear in the data. The intervals between transmissions have shortened slightly. Signal stability fluctuates more aggressively. Noise floors creep upward. The channel requires more aggressive filtering to isolate intelligible speech. Small signs of decay, small signs of exhaustion. The anomaly may be approaching its limit, which makes every new voice feel heavier than the last. Not because it is scarier, but because it might be closer to the end. One day the signal may arrive, and no voice will follow, only static, no breath, no words, no intent, just silence, and that silence will be ambiguous. It could mean the anomaly has collapsed completely, the fractured system finally resolving into non-existence. Or it could mean something far worse, that the system has evolved beyond the need to speak, that whatever remains no longer communicates in human, accessible ways, that the voices were merely an early phase of something transitioning into a form we cannot perceive. Silence does not always mean absence. Sometimes it means transformation. And until that final winter arrives, the listening rooms will continue to fill. Screens will glow. Headphones will rest against waiting ears. Humans will lean toward the dark, hoping for meaning in noise, waiting for the voice that hasn't spoken yet. Not because they want to hear it, but because once it speaks, there may be nothing left to answer.
Shadows crawl where the light won't go. A silent wind, it starts to grow.